Hello, everybody, and welcome to Library Mistakes. Just a few words about the library in case you're a new visitor. We are a free public library, open 9 to 5, Monday to Saturday. If you'd like to come along, please just register at the website, librarymistakes.com, and then you need to arrange a visit, and you'll be able to use our library. Sorry, your library. That's what a public library is, isn't it? You'll also find on the website lots of recordings of events that we've run here in the past. We also have a free podcast, which you can access through the website. There's also a walking tour app, which is also free. And if you're into financial history, you can walk from Adam Smith's grave to Charlotte Square with some talking along the way, explaining about the developments of Edinburgh's financial institutions, how they mobilized the savings of the people of Scotland to invest, to develop Edinburgh, to get it off its hill, out of its wall, but also eventually to invest right across the planet. So that you'll find that on an app called GuideGo, and you can link to that through the website. Enough, I think, about the Library of Mistakes. I'm also delighted to introduce our guest tonight, Anja Shortland, Professor of Political Economy at King's College, Cambridge, also author of a book called London. That was the other one.
The other one.
The other one. We've had her as well, so apologies. And author of Art Loss and this book on kidnap, now working on a book on ransomware. You might get the theme here. We live in a city where Adam Smith used to live. He saw the invisible hand everywhere. You've been looking in some strange places for the invisible hand. So why don't you tell us about the ransoming business, where that invisible hand is working, not working, why it might be working some places and not others. Over to you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for coming. As Russell hinted, I've been in the ransoming business for some time. Just been really intrigued by how orderly some criminal markets are, especially criminal markets where you wouldn't exactly expect order, where you expect a massive trust gap. And yet people willingly pay money to retrieve some treasure from the underworld. So I want to talk about insurance, but insurance in a different role to the one that you might be used to. Insurance as governance and insurance as criminal governance, which is something that insurers are not always super comfortable with. But they are quite happy when I say, you guys rock. You order these markets. So let's see where we get with it. So I'm going to talk about extortion. I'm going to talk about that trust gap and how surprisingly orderly these markets are. And once you start thinking about it, they must be orderly. If they're insurable, there can't be a disaster. But how much work does insurance do to make them that orderly? That's my question. I started off with this question, you insure what? And how? So, I'll talk about insurance and criminal markets. I'm looking at these three unusual markets. I started actually with piracy. Started talking to ship owners who say, oh yeah, we make contracts with these pirates and we fax the ransom and they say, yeah, we're going to accept that. And what? By fax. And you trust they're going to come off the boat. And you say, oh, they always do. And I just thought, how lovely. How unusual. And I spent 5 years listening to these ransom negotiators, not saying very much at all, until eventually they said, well, Anja, we know you're the holy fool. You're not an investigative journalist. We can't talk about Greek supertankers because we can't breach the confidentiality of what we do. But we can talk about Pedro in Mexico City and Rosa in Colombia. So I went from piracy to kidnap because we could lose a lot of the details and the noise. Then I started working on stolen art, and it was somebody who was in the kidnap resolution business who thought, well, if we can create a hostage situation around stolen art, then we can apply all the things that we know about ransom negotiations. So that was brilliant. And then everyone said, so when are you going to do ransomware? And I said, okay, when I've done the stolen art book. When I said I'm ready, they said, at last, let's talk about ransomware. A lot of people are worried about the idea of insurance governing criminal markets, and I want to touch on that. Is that actually in the public interest? Is it a good idea for insurance to be ordering these markets? Are they facilitating the crime? Are they making the crime more prevalent? Is there more crime than we should have? But anyway, let's start at the beginning. As Russell says, I look for the invisible hand in the most unlikely places. And this is the most unlikely place. You'd think this was a disaster. Whenever you look at a newspaper, it's basically things gone wrong. But that might be about what newspapers report. Yeah? If somebody pays a ransom and everyone comes back hale and hearty, that might not be such a story. So would we expect it to go right? Well, as economists, Econ 101 would say this is a disaster. You don't choose your trade partner. You're paired involuntarily with a random kidnapper. They might not have chosen you either. A lot of these kidnappings happening all over the world, you just open up a white Toyota Land Cruiser somewhere in the middle of Africa and out hop a Canadian and a Brit and a French aid worker, and then that's what you got. Yeah? You don't necessarily choose who you're going to kidnap either. Any economist will say, well, we're going to be okay as long as we're in a long-term relationship. You know, the reputational solutions will sort out almost anything. Well, here we're in a one-off transaction. So that's bad news to start with. We don't know what Uncle Ted's worth or our chief engineer. Yeah? So the price is somewhere between the lowest price that the kidnapper will accept and the highest price that somebody, it might be the family, it might be the firm, it might be a state, are willing to put on this person. And they don't know. They don't know who's paying. It's not necessarily a nice negotiation. Fingers might be threatened, there might be guns pointed. Might take a very long time, so there's a sort of psychological warfare around trying to elicit a price, so that's unusual. Let's say we have got ourselves a price, then you have to decide how you're going to pay it. It's going to be a sequential exchange, most likely, because it's never a good idea to bring the money and the hostage into the same place with the police and the kidnappers, so that goes wrong. So somebody's got to make that leap of trust and say, well, release the hostage first and you pay us afterwards. Or we're going to pay you first and then you release the hostage. Well, why would they? You're not necessarily, well, you definitely are not going to get your bank to facilitate that transfer. So you're probably looking for a suitcase of dollars being placed into tiger country. So did they receive the money? You say, I sent Pedro off with the suitcase, and they say, well, we never got it. Yeah. Can you monitor that they got the money? Probably not. It might have been intercepted. They might have got it and say they haven't, and see whether you're going to bring another one. Yeah. Another problem. And then they decide, are they going to release a future witness against them? Maybe, maybe not. How can they build reputations in this one-off scenario? Rate my kidnapper apps. Well, in the ransomware world, that's exactly what we've got. Yeah? But in the kidnapping world, this was more difficult. So we know this is difficult, and then we look at these kidnap risk map that you can find from control risks, and wherever we see all these hotspots, and then you find that there are firms that are deliberately sending people into tiger country, or complex and hostile territories, as they call them. So it can't be that bad. This doesn't look too good, does it? So, yeah, the vast majority of people are released, but there's still quite a lot of people who die, 9% who die. Some are rescued, some manage to escape on their own. But you think this is probably not something where you really want to send people, or where you can buy insurance. This is too tricky. So, but when we look at the submarket of transnational criminal kidnap and ransom, then it looks different. Almost all the people who are insured for kidnap for ransom, and that's a small subset, almost all of them are recovered. Doesn't tend to take very long. Less than a week, mostly. So clearly they're not going through the entire drama of how much is this worth. The ransoms are also not quite what you think they might be when you're stealing a chief engineer somewhere in the Niger Delta or in Colombia in the jungle. So they're often people come back for thousands, tens of thousands, occasionally a six-figure sum, but mostly it's not that expensive. And then the most wonderful thing is it almost never happens. Yeah? So the insurance business model seems to be plan A is nobody gets kidnapped. But if somebody gets kidnapped, we have a really cool plan. So this trade is actually extremely well governed. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this is governed. Yeah, so these are some data from one of the top companies that are in this, operating in this space, control risks. These are their data. So 2.5% of people are killed or died, and most of the killings are in the grabbing of the people rather than in the negotiation. The negotiation almost never goes wrong. It's like murder is not part of this game at all. This is a business transaction. So let's talk a little bit about insurance as governance. And this is something that broadly spans my research. It's a really cool literature, but the intuition is that if you insure somebody for a loss, then you want to prevent that loss as much as possible. Yeah? And it starts in the underwriting room where they say, well, what exactly do you want to do? I want to go hiking in Afghanistan. It's not insurable. Yeah? There are certain things that just should not be insurable. They're missing markets. Beg Dornbush and Fisher would hate it, but I think that's really good. Yeah? Some things should not be insurable. Some things should not happen. So you prevent adverse selection. You prevent moral hazard. You choose the people, and you incentivize them properly. Once you've incentivized them to the best of your ability, you also might want to see whether you can do something about the insured losses, make them as small as possible. You know, so you might want to say something about, if you insure a car, you might want to say something about the brakes. You might want to say something about how it's locked. You might want to say something about where it's stored. You might want to have some best management practice for sailing across the Gulf of Aden around the Cape Horn. Yeah? So Lloyd's made a massive business around a salvage protocol by having salvage agents all around the world saying, well, we're right here, we can assess the loss, we can make sure that everything gets salvaged, that things get. the salvaged goods are going to be sold. So you can do something about insured losses. You can try and recover things. You know? So the salvage protocol was first in the it was in the Black Sea, I think, where there were all these sort of people who would take people off the ships that had got themselves beached. And said, okay, we're going to do this on our own. We're not going to ask you to do it and set the price, but we're going to have the people there. It might be about conflict resolution. You might want to say, well, we're going to have a best management protocol, how we deal with this sort of thing. And then we don't want, our customers are not going to be sued for getting things wrong. So they do a lot on loss mitigation. And they also work on co-insurance. So you very rarely get fully comprehensive insurance. So what you have is exclusions. So that's co-insurance with the insured. They have to pay a certain amount. That helps with moral hazard. And they sometimes get the government involved through a backstop. Yeah? And that brings other stakeholders into this kind of game. So lots of stuff going on behind the scenes with insurance. This is the cool part of insurance that I love. So what do? They constrain the risk-taking of their customers. Yeah? You're not going to go to Afghanistan. If you're going to go to Mali, this is the taxi firm that you're going to use. These are the hotels that you're going to use. These are the restaurants that are going to be good. And we're going to give you enough information that you're not going to be in a place when we see this cavalcade of motorcycles coming down the desert road. And you're not going to go and attend this festival. Really, really fine-grained advice. But then they also do things to shape the criminals' incentives. Yeah? How difficult is it going to be to steal a car? How difficult is it going to be to hijack a ship? How risky is it going to be to do this sort of thing? How costly is it going to be? How sophisticated do you have to be to overcome our protocols? And then when we look at the ransoming business in particular, there is also a very clear shaping of prices. Yeah? Yes, we are going to buy this hostage back, but not for $1 million. Yeah? We can maybe afford 30,000, and if you're prepared to wait, there may be 40 or 45. But it's basically not worth it. You might as well drive a taxi. That is the message that you get. Already talked about recovery and salvage protocols, but that's also really important when it comes to stolen art. Yeah? You're going to pay something, but you better make sure it's not moldy and broken. Yeah? We'd rather you walked out with the painting in its frame than try and cut it out. Yeah? That's why most artworks are not actually put firmly onto the wall. You think, why not? Well, because it's much easier, or it's much cheaper to insure them if they're not ripped out of the frame. Let them just walk out with it, and we know how to get it back. Yeah? But we're looking at the problem as a whole rather than as individual bits. And as I said, limits and exclusions. So back to extortive crime, what we're trying to do is to reduce the cost of insurance broadly. So it's the entire package. People get very nervous with extortion, and they just want their treasure back, and they tend to overpay. You know, they're not looking at the problem from the point of view of the kidnapper or the art thief. They're thinking about, oh, I just want my husband back. Yeah, but if he can send the message saying it's fine if he's back at Christmas, that puts the ball in their court to say, well, I don't actually want to sit with this woman's husband for 6 long months. while she and her knitting circle get busy making the socks for the Christmas bazaar, and they might just release. Yeah? So if you take control of the ransom negotiation and you send the right message and you send the right messages repeatedly and convincingly, then you might find very different prices from the ones that people will just pay from when the money's flowing from their heart. As I said, the main problem that I saw with Kidnap was that the one-off nature of the game. Well, it's not a one-off game if you're insuring this. If you're a special risk insurer, you're going to see this over and over and over again. And therefore, we can get those lovely reputational solutions when I say, if we don't deliver the hostage this time, next time it's going to be the SAS. Next time, there's not going to be a nice guy with a suitcase full of dollars. If you don't treat hostages well, then they're not human shields for your operation. As I said, they take control of the ransom negotiations. They have their protocols. They have carrots and sticks. And they have a really cool group of people, mostly with a background in elite military service, who are completely unflappable. And they have the charisma to convince a doting wife to tell the story to the kidnapper that she doesn't half believe, but will still deliver because that's what's going to get her husband home in the minimum of time with the minimum amount of money being thrown at criminals. This has got to be the case because unless you have this protocol, unless you have this orderly resolution, you cannot sell kidnap insurance. Yeah? And people wouldn't buy it. Yeah? The reason people buy kidnap insurance, and it's mostly firms that want to send their workers, their staff into complex and hostile territories, is that they want to say, we have fulfilled our duty of care. We've done our best. Yeah? And the best way of demonstrating that is to say, well, we're with Hiscox, we're with Catlin's, we're with Travellers, we've got the insurance certificate. You only get insurance if you fulfill your duty of care. If you want to fulfill that demand for these insurance certificates, the supply side, well, you've got to be able to calculate the premium. So that means the risk has got to be calculable. Must be predictable enough for you to say, well, how much people are going to pay. So you must be able to predict the volume of kidnaps, and you must be able to predict the total cost of resolution. And if you let kidnap just unfold, we saw a little bit of that unfolding in the Somali piracy case, then you very quickly get to a point where things become uninsurable. Yeah? Or it gets so expensive that people just go around the Cape of Good Hope instead of going through the Somali basin. Yeah? So insurers have a really strong incentive to keep these markets insurable, because otherwise people will avoid the risk and they will just detour and disinvest. They don't have an incentive for kidnapping to disappear. Yeah, so you can see I'm working myself round to this public interest question. They need the risk, because otherwise there isn't a market for insurance. But on the other hand, they want it to be stable. So what I see is that there is sort of this idea of no supernormal profits, or you might as well drive a taxi. Yeah? Yes, you can kidnap, but we're going to make that so difficult for you, and we're going to make you sweat for 6 months. You might as well drive a taxi. The way this market is organized is in one place. It's only available ultimately in Lloyd's of London. So it's the Lloyd's underwriters who set the protocol, who monitor each other, who make sure that the right kinds of people are in this business. So they stabilize the behavior of everyone who's in the market, whether it's on the criminal side, but also on the resolution side. They make sure that they don't insure anything that shouldn't be insured, that's silly to insure. They make sure that the insured behave really appropriately. And they say, this is our protocol for resolution. And also, this is the price that we're going to pay in this particular region. Yeah? So if everyone comes home from the Niger Delta after 4 days for $10,000 and somebody pays $30,000 and wrecks the market, then they're going to be called up to the headmaster's office and say, well, what are you doing? What the? Yeah? So, as I said, plan A is nothing happens. So if you buy insurance, you are handed over to some security consultants or even a private military security company. And what effectively they do is they negotiate a local protection contract for you. Mostly kidnapping doesn't happen. If you've been sent anywhere by your company that is moderately problematic, you will have had perhaps a few days training, maybe just an online module about how to prevent yourself being kidnapped. That's all part and parcel of this, reducing the security risk, the information of this is not a good place to be at this particular time, avoid this spring festival. We can see somebody moving across the border here, just take extra care. And then plan B is the crisis responders that resolve the kidnaps. The crisis responders, as I said, are these elite military people who are immediately alerted through the one phone number that you're going to have in your wallet that something has happened. Ideally, you don't know that you've got kidnap insurance. In fact, if you tell your kidnapper that you've got kidnap insurance, you've just invalidated it. So chances are that you are going to say, well, you got the wrong guy. Yeah? You've got to talk to my uncle, you've got to talk to my husband, you've got to talk to my dad. We're not insured. Yeah? We don't have the power of Lloyd's of London behind this. Also, when I was working on Somali piracy, I was told by the World Bank that I wouldn't have insurance to go to Mogadishu to launch a report. So I would have said, talk to my husband. Yeah, it's not the World Bank that takes care of me. I'm just some lowly part-time consultant to the World Bank. No, you look pretty incredulous, but that was what I was told, because that's what I wanted, what they wanted me to tell my kidnapper, and then they could have held my husband's hand, shaking hand, I hope, telling them it'd be okay if I came home at Christmas. And then the kids weren't worried at all. And they were living on Coke and fish and chips and having a wild time. Yeah, so you put the plausibly most financially constrained party into the negotiating seat. And it's a business transaction. Yeah? You got Anja, good for you. We want her back. We can't pay very much, but this is business. We understand that this is business. We're going to negotiate this as calmly as possible. That time access, where I say just take your time, that's called disruptive bargaining. You don't try and resolve this as fast as possible. You don't throw money at the problem, because whatever money, whatever figure they pull out of a hat. So we want $1 million for her. And my husband goes back and says, yeah, fine. Well, how do you want it? Where do you want it? How can I deliver it? They say, well, what about $2 million? And if he says, yeah, no worries, they'll say $5 million. You know, so you can bid up the price as well as bidding it down. So you might as well bid it down. And you bid it down by making them feel nervous about saying, oh, I'm going to sit with this woman for months on end. We're going to teach her Somali. She's tickerish enough, clearly high maintenance. Yeah? They only get into negotiation as long as there's proof of life and proof of possession. There's no point entering a negotiation over a dead body, or if there is, then you pay a dead body price. You must make sure that they've actually got the hostage and they haven't got some third party who's just observed a kidnapping and is trying to make money from that. As it's a repeated game, mostly there isn't this long negotiation, but there is this focal point. Yeah? So, as I said, for years in the Niger Delta, kidnappings happen on Monday, they get resolved on a Friday, you pay, and then they have a party on Saturday, and it's mostly about funding the party. And for a long time it was 10,000, and then some dimwit paid 30,000, and that's where it's now stabilized. Yeah? But you don't have to go through this. There's a rhythm to these things, there is an expectation. And it just becomes part of doing business in these places. You professionalize the ransom drop. Somebody will walk in there. They've done it hundreds of times before. You can trust them. You're not going to get some random middleman who might just run away with the money. People have different ideas. So with Somali piracy, eventually somebody said, okay, well, we're just going to do an airdrop. Yeah, so they flew with these light planes and just dropped the money into the ocean. That ended up being the best way of doing it. As I said, if kidnappers misbehave, if hostages get hurt or even killed, then that's the end of NICE. And they just alarm the security forces. And all of these outcomes are constantly communicated within the expert community and amongst the underwriters at Lloyd's, just to make sure that everyone is doing their job properly. If people don't do the job properly, if they overpay, if they get something that's called an unclean finish, then they're not in the business for long. And that's very, very clear. So, as Russell said, that's what my big book, Kidnap, is about how tightly controlled this is by this community of underwriters at Lloyd's. My second book, then I worked with Julian Radcliffe, who's a control risks guy, who said, we know everything about ransom negotiations. Where else can we play this game? And he was talking, as he usually does, in the underwriting room at Lloyd's, and there were art insurers who were saying, well, we've got a problem. There's too much art theft. Can we do something about art theft? It was theft, it's not extortion. But Julian's sort of twist on this idea was, well, but what if stolen art was unsaleable? Yeah? What if you changed the system such that buying something in good faith meant that you searched a particular database, and if that database flagged up a problem, it would become unsaleable. Then you can go back to the thieves and say, well, you're never going to sell this at Christie's or Phillips or Sotheby's. Can we come to some arrangement? The only person who's in the market for this is the original owner or the insurer if they paid them up. So obviously this is a little bit problematic, as you can imagine. So it's a finder's fee. It's not a ransom, because we're not in an extortion scenario. We're talking about a finder's fee, and it's only a low percentage of value. But value, again, this is the insurance story here, is you want them to steal things carefully. You don't want a $30 million painting to be ripped to shreds and become a $5 million painting if you've paid out $30 million on the other side. So handle it carefully, steal it carefully, don't put it in your bathroom. Put it somewhere good. Yeah. So this is his company. So it's the Art Loss Register with hundreds of thousands of uniquely identifiable objects registered, and anybody who wants to buy an artwork in good faith must have had that database searched. As a criminal, you can't search the database. It's different from the Interpol database, where anybody can search it, and you often find dodgy art being sold with clear on the Interpol database. It basically means it hasn't passed the Art Loss Register test. But if you get caught with that kind of artwork on your hands, then you might find it's not yours because you haven't bought it in what a court would consider good faith. So it's the vendors, it's the auction houses, it's the art dealers who search the database, who have a legitimate interest in searching the database. The ALR just says don't sell it. So the criminals or whatever owner presents themselves will just be keep getting the message, we're not going to touch this with a barge pole. If they're stupid enough to send it to the auction house for evaluation, then the police might just come and fetch it. But often this just ends up as a negotiation, and there could be the underworld. It could be a finder, and they're often not. You don't always know what you got, but nonetheless, we were treating them as finders, unless proven otherwise. Or you might have these bona fide owners who say, yes, I bought this in Paris in 1970, and here is, but that predates the Art Loss Register. They have a reputation for very tough negotiations. If there's stolen art in the market, they are happy to sue the buyers of that stolen art. And then they say, well, you shouldn't have had this. You bought it cheaply. We want you to settle. We want you to compensate the original owner. They've done a lot of restitution for Jewish families. So sometimes it's not about some thief, but it's about people who've had something in their ownership for a long period of time, who've also got, don't get an economist started on property rights, but this is really interesting about property rights because you're unbundling the property rights. Yes, you can have it, but you can't sell it. How much is it worth to you to sell it? How much more can we make if we clear up this property rights mess? You can sell it in Switzerland for 1 million. You can sell it in New York for 15. Surely we can come to some arrangement. When they recover stuff from the underworld proper, then they pay very low prices, and then they send the police in afterwards as well. So overall, we're back to the insurance as governance thing. Hardly worth stealing art. So plan A is it doesn't happen. Because, Russell and I can hijack a bus, but what are we going to do with a bus? Right, so this is my latest project on ransomware. And it's all different because my insurance's governance is clearly not working as well as it should. And so we need to have an honest conversation about that. Largely because we're talking about business interruption, we're talking about businesses really hemorrhaging money, and the idea that, yes, we're going to get the data back, we're going to get Marks and Spencer's back in operation for the Christmas trade is not an attractive proposition. If anyone has tried to use the British Library, they will know what I'm talking about. The other big cost of ransomware attacks is data privacy breaches and being sued for that, and having to compensate the people whose personal data have been stolen or viewed or possibly even sold on. Again, insurers started off in this business of broadly cyber insurance. So cyber insurance predates ransomware, finding that the victims of cybercrime bungled their recoveries, and the loss adjusters came in and said, oh my God, why did you do that? So again, they said, okay, let's take the recovery process away from the victims. They're headless chickens. We can do this so much cheaper, so much better. They also found that trust gap that exists in all these other extortive crimes was massive, that people were paying for decryption keys that didn't work, that only worked partially, or that was really, really difficult to implement. So there was a real desire to tidy up this market and say, yes, we will pay for decryption keys, but only if they're proper decryption keys. We're not going to pay for phantom ransomware, we're not going to pay for scareware, and we're certainly not going to pay for malware that's just destructive. So the cyber insurance package was all about resolution services. Yeah, we're going to pay the competent hackers, we get people back online as fast as possible because it's the business interruption that they're worried about. We make sure they fulfill all their regulatory obligations. Yeah, so yeah, horse bolted, stable door, but what are you going to do to minimize the damage? And then, as your customers are still going to bungle things and ask you stupid questions that you'd rather not have talked about in the media, you're going to protect everything under client attorney privilege. So this entire world was hidden from view by putting privacy lawyers in charge of this process. So akin to my crisis responders in the ransomware world, we have crisis responders or incident responders in the ransomware world, and they offer ransomware settlement as a service. Yeah, so they decide, they investigate what ransomware has been used. Yeah. You can imagine if somebody's got a really cool piece of ransomware, then there are lots of other people who say, you've also been encrypted by Lockbit, but are they? Yeah. So make sure that they're actually using that code. Identify the threat actor group. Ideally negotiate, but negotiation means time, and not many people, not many business owners really want to have a 3 or 5 day or several week of lull when it comes to buying a decryption key. They help companies if they suddenly need $1 million in Bitcoin. Yeah, most of us will find that slightly challenging to source that amount of cryptocurrency. Make sure that they're not paying anybody who's been on some international sanctions list. Otherwise, there's going to be more trouble than that. And then they get them back online as fast as possible. As I said, those decryption keys aren't brilliant. They might need a lot of support. They will need to make a full copy of every encrypted file on their system so they can start again if it goes wrong, which it probably will. They document everything, and then finally they tot up the total and just hand it over to the insurer for reimbursement, to the extent that that's available. So as you can see, with ransomware, we're in a different world. It's not quite so much about keeping a really tight lid on prices, and that's what's made this threat as potent as it has. So the focus is on recovery rather than on focal points on keeping prices low, on normal profits. Normal profits should be really, really low, given that they're just some Russian kids with too much time on their hands. They should be getting nothing for what they're doing. But the insurer's focus is on recovery. They have done some good in the sense that the top ransomware brands offer pretty good customer service. They do deliver decryption keys. There is a support function. You can decrypt 2 files for free to show that they can do what they say they do. So there has been a big market segment that's just been tidied up. So all credit to them. But ultimately, they pay ransoms, and they pay big ransoms, and they pay them fast. And that's problematic. But if you're an insurer, that's better than destruction, that's better than data theft, that's better than being on one of those leaked data sites exposing that there's been a problem. And that was especially the case when governments victimize the victims of crime and say, oh, you didn't do this, you didn't do this properly, you let this data go, and really find the victims. So there's some regulatory issues around this as well. So what we found with ransomware is that ransoms just, they started off with like $300. Yeah, 1 Bitcoin at the time, $300. Yeah, so they were really low, and then because they never experienced anything in terms of resistance, they say, yeah, let's just throw $300 at this problem. Let's throw $1,000 at this problem. Yeah, why not $10,000? It's better than another day of not running my company. 50,000, 100,000. Yeah? It really took a long time for them to see any kind of resistance. And then, of course, threat escalation. That is the best game in town if you're in some godforsaken place in Siberia. There's no other game in town. So, to draw to a conclusion, insurance governs and orders criminal markets. I find that fascinating. Is it a good thing? Well, I think it probably is, but it also benefits the criminals, especially sophisticated criminals who can deliver on what they promise, who can overcome that trust gap. There is also this idea that they're dialing up the risks to sell insurance. I don't see that. This is Matthew Parrish from the Times. Extortion racket starts right here in the city. I don't think that is the case. What I do find is that it's more of a cock-up than a deliberate issue. Sometimes insurance as governance just fails. Sometimes it fails, and I think it certainly has with ransomware, because we're not talking about a group of 5 to 20 underwriters in one underwriting room, all sitting in one building, having coffee together, sitting in the dining room together. We're talking about cyber insurance being sold all over the world by all sorts of people, trying to cram into this growth market, then not creating a protocol for this is how we insure this particular type of thing, this is how we resolve this particular type of thing. Everyone's making it up as they go. But I also think that there's much more scope for governments to come in on that. We're seeing some really wonderful incentives and initiatives from law enforcement, such as the Lockbit takedown last year, but they're few and far between. Too much of ransomware is just done with impunity. The wrong incentives, at least at the start, when companies got hit really hard for data theft, privacy breaches. That was just an invitation to sweep things under the carpet. And sometimes I think governance fails because they're solving yesterday's problems and not tomorrow's problems. Yeah, so it's a very dynamic game. The ransomware we're now in 4th generation ransomware pretty much, beginning to see the 4th generation of ransomware. Yeah, we've got a really good protocol for 2nd generation ransomware. But yeah, there we go. So I would like to see more government in this space, more regulation, more backstops, making it pretty clear what they have to do. So not many people love insurance as much as I do. I think they're genius. I love private governance. I love the invisible hand. I love these markets. I love them because they reduce the harm to victims. They make sure that a measure of risk spreading is available, that it's not the end of the world. If something bad happens to my ship, my art, my Uncle Ted. Yeah. So they facilitate all sorts of things, including research and aid and private enterprise of every kind in these hostile and complex territories. Broadly, that's understood by government. So it's politically tolerated and sometimes even supported. It's always changing. I could always, at any time, just give you a snapshot of the state of the art in this. And if you ask me back in 3 years' time or 2 years' time, I'll be able to tell you a different story and it'll be just as exciting. As I said, I need more government. If we have collective actions problems, then we need more regulation. I think we need to see a lot more law enforcement. And I also think that if we're dealing with ransom war and a threat to national security, then you can't just say, well, that's a private problem. I'll stop there.
So I lost everything to ransomware. Crypto locker. Wouldn't pay them.
Oh, you're early adopter.
I was an early adopter. Didn't pay. And 6 months later, got an email from somebody who said they were the FBI and they could give me back all my missing files. And it was the FBI. I did get back all my missing files. So
did you still need them?
No, not really.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I would have paid for them. The 1932 is the first ransom and kidnapping insurance after the abduction of Charles Lindbergh's son. So they've been trying to form the market didn't arrive fully formed. It took a long time to get this ransom and kidnapping insurance working. Is there a breakthrough? Is there a moment where suddenly this invisible hand starts to clear? Because I don't know the terms of the 1932 policies, but apparently they weren't very good. Initially, they just followed their normal procedure, which is
you solve the problem, and we'll reimburse you afterwards.
Okay. So they just left it in the hands of the general
Exactly.
public, and that was the problem. It didn't.
And that was the problem. And then after a while, they realised that when the claims came in, they think, well, we wouldn't have done it like that. So it was in the 1970s, early 80s, when kidnapping in South America escalated and ransoms escalated, that they really thought, well, how are we going to do this? And they had two of these ransom negotiators incarcerated because they were bringing in money to pay some criminals, and then they just had a lot of time on their hands, and they just decided to go to the drawing board and say, how do we do this properly?
So you have a section in this book which says that kidnapping occurs when things fail, because it's about protection. And in a world where there's proper protection, you don't get kidnapping. Now, I happen to be from Belfast. We didn't really have very many kidnappings during the Troubles, but then, of course, everybody was paying protection. So there was, you say here, the invisible hand encourages protection money, and therefore there is enforcement on kidnappers. Is that, and when that protection isn't in place, that's when a kidnap market comes into place?
Yeah, I mean, basically, if you were all happy to pay me £1,000 a month for me not to kidnap you, I would rather save myself the hassle of kidnapping you. So if I'm the person who could kidnap you, it makes sense for us to come to an agreement that I wouldn't and you pay me the money. So that's the protection contract.
And I have to believe that you can stop other people from kidnapping me.
Indeed, you would have to have that firm belief, but if I was the local paramilitary boss or bossess.
I can believe that.
Yeah. Well, you know something about me. You'd still try to puzzle out.
So the other really interesting thing I thought was Somalia, which is divided now into Somalia and Somaliland. Mm-hmm. And at least when the book was published, there was piracy in Somalia, but not piracy in Somaliland. And you give a market, partially a market explanation for why one had developed a market in piracy and the other one hadn't.
Yeah, so piracy obviously happens at sea, but if you have the kind of disruptive bargaining protocol that the insurers are dealing with, you have to do something with the ship for 3 months or 6 months or 12 months or wherever. So piracy always had this land-based aspect to it. And basically what we found when we were mapping where the ships were being anchored, we found that there are certain areas of the vast Somali coastline. It's about as big as the eastern seaboard of the United States. Some places had pirates and others didn't. And we said, well, what's special about the ones that don't have piracy? And they had other options. They had trade. They were exporting cattle, sheep, goats, whatever. They had much more stable income flows than you would get from pirates. Yeah, pirates would get you $1 million every now and then, but they're also really unpleasant bedfellows when it comes to being a local elite. And yeah, so it was a market for protection. Who's willing to protect the pirates in the anchorage? So yeah, these protection markets are always really tightly entangled with kidnapping markets. And the kidnapping is just, somebody doesn't know who to pay. We have to have a negotiation about how much to pay. Somebody's trying to evade payment. That's when we see kidnap. But mostly we don't. As I say, plan A is nobody gets kidnapped.
And the pirates themselves are subject to the invisible hand because they have lots of rules about how the spoils are divided up, and always have done, going back hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yeah, absolutely right.
I think I'm right in saying you've met some pirates, is that right?
On Zoom.
On Zoom, okay.
Isn't that brilliant? Isn't that the best possible way for...
So tell us about the pirates you've met on Zoom and how did they self-order? You think this is cutthroat, but somehow there's a self-ordering process even amongst
Well, so it wasn't the
pirates.
pirates. So I would talk to the people that they had themselves kidnapped, inveigled, etc., to do the ransom negotiation on their behalf. So there were taxi drivers from Dallas who'd gone back to Somalia and then ended up on a ship because of their superior English skills to try and get money out of a Danish ship owner.
And how bloodthirsty are the negotiations around shares in piracy, do you know? Or is it all done very amicably and a contract is signed about who amongst the 10 pirates gets what share?
There was a certain amount of bloodshed around these things, but you also have blood feuds.
Okay.
So that's a very strong incentive not to let things escalate, because by the time you pay blood money, you've forfeited your share already. Yeah. So the incentives are pretty good around.
I'm not aware in the Wealth of Nations Adam Smith looks at the market in piracy, but he had Leith just down not far from here, so he could have found out a thing or two.
And things are not always orderly, but there is a market for order, and the people who do want to impose order, who can impose order, they can take a share for that.
Okay.
Often the lion's share.
The lion's share. I don't think there's anybody in here who's worried about kidnapping, but we were able to tell from your questions. So, Paul, you have the first question, and David, we are going to do it via the microphone, and David is rushing towards you.
Is it working? It is working.
Thank you so much. I've heard one of your talks before, and this was even more brilliant than this one. So thank you so much. I always think about not thinking of special cases, because, of course, this thing only works if there is a reasonable amount of numbers, so that the law of large numbers helps us. However, I have been, you have been trying to expand these lessons of your, you look at kidnapping, ransomware, and you're saying, we have to watch out because it's not exactly the same situation. So it doesn't exactly always scale up perfectly. And I'm thinking of cases where perhaps the criminal doesn't want to be paid in money. I'm thinking about ideological ransoms. Is there any way this can be looked at in the light of insurance giving order to that market? Let's say some kind of ideology, either paramilitaries or some kind of religious, or basically, if the kidnapper has Uncle Ted, but he's only interested in Comrade George getting out of prison, is that a risk that could ever be insured?
Yeah. So there is an answer. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there are certain things that are not insurable because somebody is sanctioned. Yeah, so if you're talking about terrorists kidnapped for ransom or terrorist kidnappings, they're uninsurable. End of story. Nobody can facilitate a ransom to any organization that is listed as a proscribed organization by the United Nations. End of story. However, that means you're going to put the least financially constrained party on the phone, which is some bureaucrats who are trying to negotiate on behalf of a countryman or countrywoman, and they end up paying massively over the odds. So, and it tends to go wrong because they don't have the experience, and you might get into the sort of ISIS scenario when they say, if we just kill some Brits, then the French are going to pay 3 times as much. And overall, we'd rather lose a few Brits and Americans and just go for the Italian and Swiss and French market. So these government-regulated markets tend to go extremely badly. So there isn't really any incentive to list anybody who's a regular kidnapper on that list of sanctioned groups, unless you think You're going to stop them from doing what they're doing. If it's lives on the line, that's problematic. But yeah, I mean, we often then have people coming on the phone saying, well, we're from the commercial arm of the Al-Shabaab. It has nothing to do with terrorism. Sometimes you can resolve that by shifting hostages to the pirates. And then you go down the line and say, well, we can't pay you anything, we can't do anything for you here, but we might be able to pay somebody else. Yeah. And that, but then you don't have a government on the line, you have a small subsidiary of a big company or a family that might pay something. So you just quietly put it down that commercial line. Occasionally the negotiators say, have some political demand, and they said, well, we can only give you money, but we can take out a one-page advert in the Sunday Times. If you'd rather have that, we can do that.
Okay, we have another question, I think, right at the front here. David?
I worked for the World Bank most of my career, and I continued to work for them for a while as a consultant after retiring to Scotland. On a trip to a mission, as we called them, as you know, to Yemen, sometime between 2004 and 2010. My wife, who often came with me and who was very adventurous, often went off to travel on her own, to the dismay sometimes of the governments we were working with, particularly in, as I recall, Romania and China. But in Yemen, she desperately wanted to go across the empty quarter, and she'd been told by a friend who had lived in Yemen that she knew a travel agent to get a Bedouin guide. Since my wife had written a book, one of her books, her first book, about the British fascination with the Arabs, and it was about the Bedouin, basically, she should have known better.
Well, she made a protection contract,
she took this trip, and we've been reassured, and I talked to the travel agent too, and I was busy. Halfway, well, in the middle of the empty quarter, of course, she was going in a Land Rover. They announced they'd run out of gas, no petrol, and the Bedouin guide was trying to get a signal on his phone to talk to somebody. And my wife thought, well, that's enough of that. She went over to the car and said to the driver, drive on. And he did. Then it appeared that they just gave up. And she thought that it was because they discovered she had a British passport, and that the rumor she'd heard was that the British government would not pay a ransom, which raises...
Correct.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now,
yes.
I know as an American traveling in an international group, the Yemen government at that time supplied armed guards for me, and I was with a group. But she did escape, and it is possible, however, that they gave up because, as the Bedouin guide kept asking her, why would your husband let you travel alone? And maybe he thought that it wasn't going to get any money out of me. I don't know. But is that an option for some governments, that they just refuse to pay?
Americans also don't pay terrorists. Or they said they didn't, and then they had the James Foley incident, and now they're not so sure. There is always a question around this. But anyway, I mean, being kidnapped in Yemen is not the end of the world. They have a very... They have all sorts of informal institutions and social norms around kidnapping. And it's going to be... It's enforced hospitality. So... she might end up paying, we might end up paying a little bit more for the petrol.
Can you give me 3 places you really don't want to be kidnapped?
I've been told that the only place they can't get me back from is Iran.
Okay.
So it's Iran, Iran, and Iran.
Okay, thank you. Very clear. Robert?
I guess sectors like auto insurance are very low margin. Is kidnap insurance and the other insurances you've talked about, are they high margin businesses?
I don't know. I just don't know. It's not something we talk about.
Okay, we'll have one last question.
Hello. I wanted to ask, you mentioned a lot more about compliance when talking about ransomware. Is it harder to pay out for ransomware because of the fact, by definition, it's probably got a paper trail? So even if you've got anonymous accounts in cryptocurrencies, you know that certain accounts belong to terrorist organizations, whereas in, I guess, more traditional kidnap, as you said, you can have a little bit more of an ambiguity about, oh, we can't pay you, we can pay someone else. Does that factor into the difficulty with getting it paid and getting the stuff back at all?
Well, one of them was the cash business, and that hasn't really gone to crypto. Yeah, would be possible. It would be cheaper than flying a plane across the jungle and then dropping something off. But yeah, kidnap for ransom generally has not gone high tech.
I'm all being, can
Yeah.
you play more ambiguous with the morals of it? In that, as you said, if you know that Al-Shabaab has a commercial arm,
You can't deal with the commercial arm of the Al-Shabaab. I just thought it was so lovely that they tried to do that particular thing. So that was not a possibility. You cannot pay a ransom to a prescribed organization. But it's just one more way of managing the expectations of a kidnapper and say, well, the family might be able to do something for you, but we can't take it out of our account. So we're seriously sitting here knitting socks for the church bazaar. And all of that is really good, because this is not a problem that you want to throw money at, especially if you're dealing with terrorists, because they're not going to put that money into soup kitchens.
The advice you have for anybody being kidnapped is don't resist, based on the statistics you showed earlier on. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. Just enjoy.
Well,
it's going to be fine.
the Library of Mistakes always has practical advice, but this is the first practical advice we've had on kidnapping. And that was tremendous. Anja, thank you for coming all the way from London to provide that.
Brilliant.
And,
this is such a great space.
thank you.
Well done for creating it.
Thank you. It's even better than that. There's free drink at the back of the room.
No such thing, but there you go.
Courtesy of our friends at Kennox Asset Management. And tomorrow night we have tickets for the Whiffin Poofs. And if you don't know who the Whiffin Poofs are, they are an a cappella group from from Yale University. And they will be here tomorrow night. A few tickets left for that. You'll find that through our... you'll find it.
Yeah. Google the Whiffin Poofs.
Yeah, and it's actually in the invite you got for this event. So anyway, please join me in thanking Anja.